All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday show of Two Guys Talking History. We got a couple of items for you tonight, including the update from last week in Syria and a interesting development that happened fairly recently, or kind of sort of might be happening fairly recently, in Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
I just logged in. Okay.
Yep, we're live.
Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
All right, and we have a guest this evening. If you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Timur Nersesov. I guess a little bit of background. I have an Army background in the United States, some active duty time, and then as a reservist as well. For the last 15 years or so, I've worked in first for about a decade as a consultant within the government across national security enterprise, State Department, Department of Defense, DHS, as well in the intel community. And for the last 6 years or so, I've been, I did transition to the software world where I do AI, still very focused on national security space, but AI as well. I've published a couple of pieces over the last few years on the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. So it's something I've follow very closely because I am in fact Armenian and I am from Azerbaijan. Though been it's for going over 30 years now. So that's kind of the brief bio. And as a preface to everything, I'll say my opinion doesn't represent the Department of Defense, the Army, or any employers. I'd have to put that one out there. And I also teach at the U.S. Army Command General Staff College as well, so on a part-time basis.
Well, thank you for joining us again tonight. So I figure we can start with Syria. Last week, there were reports from the Syrian, what was the precise organization? The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, that the government forces, they're putting it to the government forces, and pro-Assad fighters engaged in combat, leaving hundreds of civilians and fighters, thousands of civilians and fighters dead, including Christian minorities and Alawites, which were purported to be revenge killings because that was the sect that, the Alawites was the sect that Bashir al-Assad belonged to before his ouster. And so that has been a topic of discussion for the people who watched the Middle East for the past week quite intensely. I don't necessarily know if this is unexpected. Like when we talked about Syria last time, Hetman, we both brought up the fact that it was very likely that people were going to end up dying in the chaos that followed.
Yeah, and then it would probably result in a continued conflict. I think that this is, only the beginning, unfortunately. I have heard that. Oh, go ahead.
Please finish.
I have heard that some of the scale of the killings has been blown out of proportion, but I've seen a lot of videos popping up on Twitter of the aftermath of these killings, and it looks really, really bad. So I don't know if this is the beginning of something that is going to get much worse, or if they will handle the situation. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the UNR or UNR government of Ukraine during the Civil War period. So like 1918 to 1919 specifically, where you have the center unable to control its forces. And it seems like the current government in Syria isn't exactly, condoning such violence, but obviously they're unable to prevent it. So that's kind of like my non-expert take on what's going on.
Yeah, I think I think the broader conflict issue is a thing, and the fact that the open question of how this coalition, that the HTS was, at the head of with Jelani is going to conduct itself, how much control that the HTS government has over all the militias that comprise the winning coalition, if you will. But I think it's also, I followed the events pretty much within minutes of it hitting the social media, and it's frankly, to me, it's very much in the style of a classic Middle Eastern pogrom, where a single incident, which was, so the whole thing was precipitated, for folks that might not be following this closely, with a set of coordinated attacks on the new regime checkpoints across the Latakia, and so that coastal area, which is heavily the Alawite and as well as Christian minority. And that wound up, it was a pretty significant attack. I think, I forget the number, but I remember seeing a number where it was like something like a dozen locations were attacked, and the casualties were in the dozens, if not below hundreds. But within 24 hours, what precipitated was basically I think it was the militias that happened to be manning those checkpoints and kind of nominally responsible for state security in the area. Just went on an all-up program, and the numbers of casualties are, 1,000 plus or minus 200. I think the most reliable reports. I've seen reports much higher than that, but not something that's been kind of like widely reported. And it's basically it was like a 2-day orgy of violence that it doesn't seem like it was coordinated from Damascus. I think at least that's the Syrian government's official position, is that A got out of control, and we're sending shortly within 24 to 48 hours. They were dispatching, I guess you call more loyal or more under control elements of the security forces to get the thing under control. But by the time it was said and done, there was several thousand refugees, hauling up in the Russian air base that's still in the area for protection, as well as, like I said, 1,000 or so casualties. And seeing the same videos of just basically executions left and right, kind of scenario. But a very classic pogrom.
It was hard to get a handle on what was happening in particular.
For sure.
A lot of the information that was coming out of it kind of escalated very quickly to, like, there are thousands dead, there are all these people dead, and then some people glommed on. So some commentators glommed on to, they're killing Christians and no one's doing anything about it, and then some other commentators glommed onto that. So the entire thing got distorted really quick. I haven't seen estimates higher than 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 that seem reliable. But that's still a lot of people when you get down to it for 2 days.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you've seen the videos, and if folks don't know, in terms of like having followed a number of these conflicts in the social media space, which is actually kind of ironically what I also do in sort of my professional life, is provide AI platforms that help track these types of things. So I was able to leverage some of those to kind of keep track of things. And in a lot of these events, an interesting pattern emerges. If you want to follow what's going on, is especially in the Near East and Africa, Telegram winds up being very much the first place of social media reporting. So you get like a flood of Telegram posts with videos, and then after about a day or two, the conversation transitions more to like the X-Twitter space and other spaces where now you're talking about the events, more so than what happens within the Telegram space, which just floods instantly with imagery in particular. But yeah, it was definitely for the world to see. There was nothing discreet about any of this.
Yes. And again, with everything that's been happening in Syria, it doesn't seem terribly surprising. There's a big order for any group that's transitioning into becoming a government to taking over a country. And Syria has been racked by civil war now since
Yeah, it's going to
2014.
be there's a lot of, I mean, even in the best case scenario, there's going to be a lot of growing pains, during
And
this whole phase. But
I would
my
argue that
and
the best case scenario isn't happening right now. They're getting pressure from Israel. They're getting pressure. Difficulty controlling their own forces. They're gonna have a lot. It's gonna be rough, and I think this is gonna get much worse before it gets better.
that's what I was
Well, I
just
think
going to ask Pima.
yeah, I think it's also important to remember that the HTS government, it's not like it's an organized army or an invading army that was cohesive and responsive to a unified political force. It was a coalition of rebels, essentially.
Yeah.
So you're talking about dozens of organizations with very different leadership relationships to the Giuliani government. That is going to be a challenge for the Giuliani government itself to one open question is, how much control do they actually have over these organizations, and how responsive are they to directives from Damascus, if you will? And if there are, let's say, conflict of interest, if you will, between any of those organizations and the central government, does the central government have enough power to, at this point, as they're consolidating, do anything about it? So it's a very fluid situation, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and the other real danger is that the HTS government doesn't hold together at all because they have all these internal divisions that may come up afterwards, which will probably spill out into fresh violence. So it's not impossible to say that Jelani might not be the guy in charge by the end of the year. Although he's, for a jihadist, pretty talented at leadership, so he might survive.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely an open question, no doubt. And I think he has other, unlike being a rebel leader, now he has other interests like seeking international legitimacy and running a state. I think they've there was news a few days ago of them reaching a deal with the Kurdish forces to try to bring them into the the ruling government. So now you have this other faction now as part of the coalition that is substantially large and is not at all responsive to kind of the jihadi crew that is trying to play ball, essentially. So to call Syria, this current Syrian government, unified is it's a stretch. And what happened last week is kind of an example of it doesn't seem at all that it was coordinated or directed. It seems like it was essentially a spasm of violence that just burned really, really fast.
What do you think? This is my question for you, Timo. What do you think? I mean, will happen in the future? I mean, that's a pretty general question, but do you think that, in your professional view, that the situation will devolve, or that this new Syrian state can work?
That is a question I don't think any expert has a really, no matter their expertise, in solid insight into. Mainly because I think it's too complex. There's too many actors on the stage, and the script of the play is all about power politics. Syria, again, if you follow kind of the history of Syria, was in sort of the classic tradition, a cobbled together country. There was no natural reason for that state to exist. It didn't grow from its own power base, and evolved really quickly into essentially a Assad family monarchy within 40 years of its existence. And the Assad government coming out of with their power base being the support of the minorities, created a lot of animosity with the Sunni majority as well as the Kurds. So it's a really complex stage, and I think it is an open question of just how much goodwill and influence the Jelani government really has on the ground. Um, Jelani is, from our point of view being like from sort of the Western point of view, he's a he was one of the jihadis we were fighting in Iraq, right? So when I was a U.S. Army soldier leading troops in Iraq, Jelani and his crew were our enemies. So he's very experienced. He fought in Iraq against us, then went back, with the unraveling of the Arab Spring, and became, grew through the power ranks of, became the ISIS government, and then broke off from that. So he has these jihadi roots, but he also needs to seek legitimacy, and he has to seek a power position that is going to be acceptable to all these factions, including the hardcore jihadis and the minorities. If he can pull it off, regardless of what we think of him as a person or as our enemy or not, that will be some high-end statesman skills.
100%.
We don't know if he has those.
Yeah, it would be a delicate
Do you
tightrope
think
to walk.
he is reformed by any means, or is he just doing this, in a pragmatic way? I kind of liken it to a small degree to when Stalin died, you had people who were otherwise, they got their start under him. They, did a lot of dirty work for him, including Khrushchev. But it seems that when he dies, the whole system changes to a large degree. It becomes less oppressive and less violent, for sure. Is this what we're looking at? Because some people associate the thaw with people coming to their senses. I've heard some people say that someone like Khrushchev would never come to his senses in regards to that he just simply changed with the times. But it's a completely different situation. I'm wondering if maybe his years of fighting have changed him, and that maybe we're looking at someone that has become a lot more moderate, or is he just being pragmatic?
It's definitely an interesting question. So I will caveat what I'm about to say with that. Even though I specialize in counterterrorism and counterviolent extremism for a number of years, that was mostly in the Obama years. So we're a decade plus removed from that. So sure there are experts that have been paying attention to his rise and evolution far more closely than I have. So with that caveat, it is, I think, an interesting question to say: is reform driving his positions and his seemingly more conciliatory, more tolerant approach than what we would expect from a hardcore jihadi, or what we saw with ISIS during its heyday in 2014-15? I don't know if it's true reform or if it's kind of a recognition that he can only go so far before he engenders another rebellion. So again, that could be a testament to him growing up as a statesman now. But changing his stripes ideologically, I don't think is really on the table. So being ideologically committed, but at the same time pragmatic, those aren't mutually exclusive. And I don't see how he would have had the power base, again, that I followed him more closely over the last few years, maybe it'll be clearer, with the jihadis, with HTS, and the internal power struggle with the sort of the Daesh-ISIS split that he did a few years ago, but still in charge of mostly what we would consider jihadi militias in the Syrian civil war. So I could easily see a scenario where once he bides his time and feels secure that those convictions, those more hardcore convictions, translate into domestic policy, more restrictive policy, more oppressive policy, or maybe not. Like, it's a interesting, complex question. I would not be surprised if it's less change stripes than it is pragmatism.
Yeah, I think it's way too many moving parts to give an answer to that in any real sense. Again, because you have a lot of different pushing and pulling factions, not only in HTS's coalition, but outside that have designs on Syria and will intervene, like Turkey and Israel, both, if they don't like what's happening. And that can play a huge
Yeah,
role in what happens.
and I did see an interesting analysis that I wish I'd followed it a little further, but it really caught my attention. I think it was early last week, where when Israel started to get involved a little bit in the aftermath of the massacres, uh, and the analysis was that the Alawites and the minorities in Syria might actually be much more open to Israel, and that um, the Assad government, which was an Alawite dominated government, that government's hostility to Israel was mostly driven by its relationship with Iran and sort of placation of the Sunni majority, and not by sort of a natural Alawite allegiance to the Palestinian cause, for example, and that they would be much more open to Israeli intervention now that that's not a factor. Now that that's kind of like the Hezbollah slash Iran alliance that Assad had is not really on the table. It's an interesting analysis, but admittedly, I only saw a little bit of it.
I know that the Druze, for example, are very much inviting Israel into their majority section of Syria. Like they really would like them to I don't know if occupy is the right word, but create a buffer zone there where they're protected by their forces. And then I think like the Druze constitute probably the biggest minority group in Israel within the IDF. So that's also certainly a factor.
Yeah, that's actually been a fascinating development with the Druze inviting Israeli support in southern Syria, and that's exactly like one of those. That's one of the actors on the stage that Jelani has to deal with, or potentially face another separatist movement, but this time on the doorstep of Damascus itself. That's been evolving, and I'm very curious to see how far it goes and how far Israel is willing to push that that support, or how far the Druze are willing to push. Are they angling for something along the lines of like what the Kurds did, which is say, hey, we're willing to play ball, but you have to, we're not dissolving, we're not just giving up, we're members now of this, and they want that level of recognition and what comes with it, or if they're actually angling for opposition to Damascus. It's a very interesting question.
I think that can lead maybe into our next topic.
Yeah, I was about to say,
of course,
let's head over to the Caucasus. The happiest place on earth. So
Yeah.
it was brought to my attention last week, because I wasn't paying nearly as close attention as I should have been, that Armenia and Azerbaijan have I guess the best word is a framework to end the decades-long conflict between them. That last year kind of, I guess, culminated is the best word in effectively the ethnic cleansing of much of the remaining ethnic Armenian population from Azerbaijan. And so my understanding of this is that there is a framework in place, but Azerbaijan is holding out for a change to the Armenian constitution in order to have it remove references to implicit territorial demands on Azerbaijan. This is, I think, kind of a long shot to this conflict ending, but it is it's new, it's exciting. That's all I got.
No, it is. It is. New and exciting, I guess, are
Not necessarily
appropriate adjectives.
hopeful, but new and exciting is.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing started with a joint statement, not joint statement. Sorry, it was not in fact a joint statement, which is an important little detail, but separate statements from Armenia and from Azerbaijan about coming to, making progress on the deal. But a lot of the reporting is really focused on Armenian concessions more than anything else. It's almost like to put it crudely, hey, agree to this, and we won't be as belligerent. Now, in parallel, you have Azeri officials asking folks not to record troop movements yesterday. So it's yeah, interesting in itself.
They're already using sort of, they're developing a casus, what's the Latin term, casus belli or whatever.
Yeah.
That Armenia is building up troops on the border with Artsakh and then Nakhichevan. So
Yeah.
both of these are areas which are, claimed and controlled by Azeri forces, and it's looking like they're really, especially with the world, distracted with all these other conflicts. It seems like that they're.
Yeah, I think it's so. I'll quote here something that that the Carnegie Endowment wrote, commenting on the issue 2 days ago, and it's very, I think, very telling. To quote it, it says, Pashinyan has given away a lot, and his pockets are now almost empty. And he's coming into an election coming up. So, in essence, he doesn't have much left to negotiate with. And I think the point of confusion in general to the global audience that is even remotely aware of this even happening, which is not a huge part, right? In itself, is that Karabakh was, what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh over the last 4 years, the initial war, the breakdown, essentially Azerbaijan unilaterally deciding that the Minsk process was no longer going to work, and what the ethnic cleansing of 120,000 Armenians that followed was an issue, but it wasn't all the issues. And Azerbaijan has spent the better part of the last 2 years building a narrative in domestic media around the, what they call Western Azerbaijan, which is basically modern Armenia, around the linkage of their exclave Nakhichevan, which Armenia separates from Azerbaijan proper. These aren't, trivial issues when an entire population is essentially being readied for a narrative that says, hey, you see that thing over there, it belongs to us. And at the same time, we're talking about a negotiation from position of strength for Azerbaijan, from position of weakness for Armenia, that seems to be, by and large, Armenian concessions to Azeri demands to stave off another war. So there's nothing about it that seems durable. If you know what I mean, like if all the signs were pointing towards Azeri desire to reconciliate, if Azerbaijan was saying, "Hey, yeah, we're done. We got what we wanted. Hey, Armenia, can we negotiate around this whole corridor thing? Here's what we'll do for you. Do this for us." That would be a very different conversation than, "Hey, Armenia, we want you to do these 3 things, like change the constitution," which is actually not in it's in the Declaration of Independence that presupposes the constitution. Hey, we don't want international peacekeepers on the borders. hey, we need you to delimit the border under our terms. And by the way, we're telling all of our population that you shouldn't exist. It's a those are two different negotiation contexts.
So yeah, 2 notes, because I've been asked to make a correction. It was not from Azerbaijan last year; it was from Artsakh. And very much who told me to make that correction was Svet TV. No, you're fine, puppy. Anyway, and I don't want to get an ice pick in my head, so I have issued that correction.
Yeah. Yes, Artsakh, the Armenian name for the region is Artsakh. Globally, it's usually called Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a Soviet era name for the region. But yeah, that is accurate. It is Artsakh.
Yes, and the second specific thing I want to point out is like this kind of reminds me, and I have been playing with this in an essay script. This kind of reminds me of the post-Oslo Accord Camp David summit for Israel and Palestine, the kind of one-sided negotiation of it all. So, like you have Azerbaijan, who's very much trying to position themselves kind of to get a non-peace treaty that lets them do what they want to do anyway. And I guess that makes a certain amount of sense. But I think the other parallel I draw is this is kind of like a hang on, I have the word. It's right there. The Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, where they kind of position themselves in an advantageous way. Or at least Azerbaijan is attempting to position themselves in an advantageous way that they can win the next conflict.
For sure. And that I don't think that can be ignored. It's I think there's a how do I put it? There is a general belief for some reason when we talk about foreign policy in particular, domestic policy to a certain extent, that everything is new, and that we should take, for people that don't have a particular partisan stake in the outcomes. So let's call it the American or the Western point of view, neither the Azerbaijani or the Armenian point of view, and they're trying to kind of be quote unquote neutral or unbiased. Objective, yes, let's use that word. Lovely word. That we should take at face value what's being said. Whereas history is not all that, difficult to follow. And in 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, if you read even American diplomats and statesmen, they're paying attention to a lot more than what the official pronouncements are. And I think one of the most interesting examples of that is the Marshall Plan. When that hit, the Marshall Plan was announced by Marshall, I think it's 48, 47, it's shortly after the war, but it was announced in a speech in New England. It wasn't like an official statement by the U.S. government to the European states to say, hey, this is what we're doing. It was a policy pronouncement that then the European states realized that, this is an opening to have that conversation with the Americans. The Americans are willing to do this. And so when you have these maneuvers, so quoting that Carnegie Endowment article I mentioned a second ago, they note that a few hours before the Azerbaijan Foreign Ministry announced a breakthrough in the negotiations, Aliyev gave a speech basically where he repeated Maximo's demands, all the grievances and accusations against Armenia that he's made for years. So when you have something like that happening in parallel, you can't ignore the part that doesn't sound official and just take the one that you like, what you like to hear is that the foreign ministry is making a formal announcement that is quote unquote the position of the government. Yet the president of that same government is making a speech that is in tone and character seems to contradict this goodwill breakthrough, right? That you would think as, goodwill negotiations led to an agreement of some kind.
And we're
So-
dealing with that exact parallel now with Ukraine. And
Well,
yeah, perfect example. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the thing is a fundamental understanding of conflict or war cessation is that this is not the end. Like one of the points Clausewitz makes is that the outcome of wars are rarely final. So if you're coming up with a treaty, that you have to be looking ahead to the fact that you may in fact be in a conflict again. Which becomes an imperative for for Armenia, for example, or Ukraine, to get the deal that allows them to resume the conflict on favorable terms if it has to come to that, where they might be invaded. Because let's be frank, in both of these cases, let's assume that this treaty goes through, and for both these cases, I'm not optimistic, but let's assume that goes through. They have to be able to be prepared to be attacked again in short order.
Yeah, absolutely that. Laying that groundwork, strategically makes sense too, right? You don't want to tip all your hands. So that's kind of like, again, let's say the objective read on any kind of negotiation. But I think at the same time we need to appreciate that since 2020, when all this unraveled, the Aliyev government, which is functionally a monarchy in Azerbaijan, it's been playing it safe, but with some risk. So it's every step, if you kind of plot them out on the timeline, becomes, hey, I think I'm going to try to push. I have enough support to push, whether it's Turkish support, Israeli support, distraction of the world with the COVID pandemic, President Trump in the White House here, so he's not going to, you don't expect him getting too upset over the Minsk process being essentially walked out on by Azerbaijan, and seeing what happens. And then all of a sudden it worked. Okay, well, that worked. Right. Well, what's the next step we can push? Well, then we have the war in 2022 that where Azerbaijan probed into Armenia proper for several days and wound up taking positions on the wrong side of the border. And then that paused. Then you have the siege of Artsakh that then essentially forced the population into, basically it was a besieged population. The Russian peacekeepers functionally abdicated all responsibility for the peacekeeping part, and probably, and I would not be surprised, although again I don't know for fact with level of certainty you would get from looking in Russian archives, that the Russians essentially agreed to the whole thing, or at least once it started to unravel, they were like, yeah, okay, well, we're not gonna try to stop this. And you can tell some of that, in the 24-hour attack that wound up causing precipitating what ended up being the total emptying of Artsakh of every single Armenian down to literally a dozen individuals being left all elderly. The Azerbaijanis accidentally killed the deputy commander of the Russian peacekeeping force with several of his men. Yes. Yeah, and the Russians were like, oh yeah, no, we take your apology, no worries. And that's just total, whatever, we don't care. So now, I think Azerbaijan, from their point of view, has a problem. On the one hand, they have the policy goal that the president is broadcasting domestically that Armenia should be smaller than it is right now, and the parts of Azerbaijan that are currently separated by it need to be reunited. That's the position. The pragmatic side is Azerbaijan, even though it's 3 times larger than Armenia population-wise, still can't go at it alone to conquer a country of 3 million people that hate them to the core, who they hate also, so it's not going to be a kind invasion, and then manage that without Turkish support and, frankly, Israeli support and Russian support. But each one of those players also have their own interests.
And two of those
I think Azerbaijan
are going to be occupied for the foreseeable future. From Israel and Russia.
Absolutely.
Like Russia.
Yeah, and
I don't think Russia has any more blood to squeeze from the stone that they're not putting into Ukraine.
100%.
sure, like yeah, Russian direct support is not something that's going to come. However, the Russians still have troops in Armenia proper, and at the same time, Russia might still give the green light if all the other pieces on the board are in play. What I think is safe to say is that Azerbaijan knows that it can't do it alone. So unless all the other key players are on board, either by staying out of the way or by directly supporting, which Turkey and Israel will have to for Azerbaijan to pull it off. Um, it's they're kind of like they're stuck in this position where they're not going to give up their aims, but they're going to keep the process alive, and they're going to act the normalization bit so they don't become too much of a pariah. To keep the EU and the United States happy with progress, so to speak, diplomatic progress, which is going to give the EU and the US, to the extent that they care, signals that things are working and they don't have to pay too much attention.
Well, I give Trump a 1 in 10 chance of finding either of those countries on a map. Marco Rubio, I'll give a 3 in 10 chance.
Yeah, well, yeah. Honestly, like kind of all joking aside, the fact that we have Trump and we're 3 months in is probably, it's not lost on Azerbaijan that is a very favorable position, but they still need Turks, they need the Israelis to take off some of the financial pressure and some of the manpower pressure that an invasion of Armenia would actually entail. And of course, you got Iran right next door, which might have a mood swing one way or the other. So they have to be on board as well. Can't forget them. So it's complex enough, and the Azerbaijanis are playing it safe, but not giving up.
The Azeri Israeli relationship is kind of an enigma to me. It's like the one, like their best friend in the Islamic quote unquote world, even though it's not Azerbaijan isn't really the most Islamic country by any means.
Yeah, it's definitely not a model of an Islamic country for sure.
And of course, back in the day, Baku was a very cosmopolitan place, and there were a lot of Jews that lived there. My grandfather's first cousin, he was from Ukraine originally, got wounded in the Second World War, sent there to a field hospital. It was actually during the defense of Kiev, and he met his Russian or ethnic Slavic wife, and had his whole family there. And he would actually say to his grandkids and children, I'm really glad I wound up here in a Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim republic, because the people here are not as anti-Semitic as they were in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And to people in Priluki, I'm not, where he's from, I'm not calling you that, if any of you are watching this.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a couple of interesting threads there. I think it's important to remember the Baku in particular as the largest city in Azerbaijan, where in a country of 10 million people, 4 million people live in Baku, right? So it's kind of it defines everything in that country. In the Soviet period, Baku was a very cosmopolitan. Now, granted, a quarter of the size of what it is now, but a very cosmopolitan city. It was a resort city. It was an industrial city. It was heavily built by Russian and Armenian financiers and immigrants. No, Armenians are immigrants, but you know what I mean. Like locally, that was a center of Armenian activity. I think at one point, something like between a quarter and a third of the population of the city was Armenian. So a cosmopolitan city that doesn't have sort of the East European legacy of anti-Semitism would feel very much like that. Now it's like 90% Azerbaijani. It's not a cosmopolitan city in that sense anymore. But at the same time, Azerbaijan is still mostly secular, still heavily Russian influenced culturally and economically. But for Israel, I think it's important to remember that Azerbaijan is next door to Iran. That is the value of Israel, of Azerbaijan to Israel. Azerbaijan allows Israel to operate out of Iran. And in return, Israel supplied something like 60% of the more advanced weapons used by Azerbaijan in its wars over the last 4 years. So there's a very strong relationship there that is pragmatic. That is, Israel is a very large weapons manufacturer in general. So you can almost forget it in terms of like that broader interest of having a launching pad next door to Iran. Israel is also just very happy to sell weapons as a massive manufacturer. And so you have that, the Israeli industry is happy to have a new customer. The Israeli government is happy to have a collaborative state next to Iran, kind of a match made in heaven from their point of view. And it's one that doesn't really care that they're Jews. And so it kind of works out for everybody in that case.
Except Armenia.
The whole way to solve this whole problem is to remove the current Iranian regime somehow, or if the people were to somehow have an uprising and remove them themselves, if that was at all possible, which it's not.
Can't disagree there. I mean, Iran is tragic. What a waste of human capital over 2 generations with a regime that just suppresses an otherwise a very diverse, very cosmopolitan, very well-educated population. That's just, it's a human tragedy in many ways, to be honest.
Shout out to all our Persian friends. We hope that you enjoy the freedom that you once had in the future. Actually, even more so than under the Shah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say a much more cosmopolitan democracy would be a better end state for Iran, such as it were, than they had under the Shah.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be an amazing outcome. I'm not
a likely
one,
but an amazing one.
Yeah, not like. Yeah, this is true. I'm a huge proponent of democracy.
I'm just saying that's not the direction things are heading in anywhere.
No. Well, I will say that it's actually funny. So back in 2003, when the Iraq War kicked off, I was finishing my senior year at Michigan, and I was an anthropology major with a focus on Near East archaeology. And during the invasion, I happened to be working on a work study program, and so I sat in the office with Henry Wright, who's one of the preeminent, actually Persia experts, but Near East experts as well. And he was in there as I'm sitting there cataloging Syrian digs. He was taking calls from the Pentagon because the Pentagon wanted to know, what not to bomb in Iraq, basically as a matter of minimizing collateral damage to historic sites. And so he was fielding these calls as I'm sitting there next to him. And at one point, he made an observation that stuck with me forever. And he's like, Saddam, he's normal by Near Eastern standards. The Near East,
he was.
The Near East knows how to function with a king, and that is the norm. That is the fundamental norm through written history in everywhere in the world, but in Near East in particular, given that where all this written history is, and that needs to be appreciated, right? The Tsarist government / premier of the party / president that controls everything is a monarchy, which is normal to the Russians. It's normal to the culture. It's normal to the psyche, and the intelligentsia might want progress and democracy and all that, but the common people in their expectations and preferences and cultural norms understand monarchy, and that winds up winning. Same with Iran. The Ayatollah is a monarch with a religious bend. He's a Shah with a religious bend. and that's normal. Now, ironically, in Iran, they do have actually a democratic system for below the Ayatollah, but it's supervised by a monarch, right? So you get the presidential
Yeah.
elections. It's ironic that there's actually, in Iran's case, ironically, there is some 40 years of habits built around things like elections. It's just that they're always defined.
What's the joke from the Helldivers game? Managed democracy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a point that I've been reading James Gelvin's History of Israel and Palestine. And one of the points he makes very often is that Arab governments are very well situated and suited in the Middle East to operating under effectively monarchical or dictatorial regimes, and do a very good job of that. And they have all the institutions of that in play. I think that's kind of hard to argue with. I also think that, broadly speaking, the collapse of Iraq as a institution that can be a counterweight in opposition to Iran has catapulted Iran to this position where they're not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, and you can take even a longer horizon view on the Near East. Iran is, since 560 BC, the hegemon of the Near East, the regional hegemon, and it has always been. You don't, that 2,500 year history is not trivial. Islam changed some of its character, but even the Abbasid caliphates lasted, a couple of centuries before succumbing to all kinds of things. Iran's still there. So
it's so centrally located in particularly for trade, for most of its history, up until the point where you start to see this collapse of not the Ottomans, Byzantine Rome. They're so vital for trade and controlling that trade that they just dominate so much of that period of history.
And they dominate culturally. Like, Iran has been invaded multiple times. But, if you take the Turks or the Mongols, whenever they come to stay, they become Iranians. They don't change the character of the place.
I think Persian was one of the court languages, actually, of the Seljuk Turks, like the Ottoman Empire, as far as I know.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Their influence is undoubtedly, strong and impactful regarding the region, and even beyond that to a large extent. One thing too that's very interesting, although not quite related, the Azeris are actually, I believe, actually, like culturally and even like their genetics they're actually Persians.
Heavily so. Yeah, there needs to be some credit given to kind of the facts on the ground, which is that the Azeri cultural, linguistic, and even to a certain point genetic legacy is that they are the Iran side of the Turkic migrants. But just like what happened in Anatolia and in the Armenian highlands, the Turks that showed up with the Oghuz invasions melted into the population and took on the character of the folks there, except they kept their language. And so, for a random Azeri,
largely a linguistic change and shift rather than a genetic one. That's why, when I think if most Turks, if they were to do, a DNA test, they cluster close with Greek populations, with Armenians and Kurds, I believe, with the Anatolian populations that were there for a very long time. They certainly, a lot of them do not look like how I don't want to use the term real Turks, but how
Yeah,
Central
that's not a
Asians.
can of worms
Yeah.
at all.
but on that point, I mean, I think it is definitely a touchy subject for 100 reasons. But there are facts that we can point to, and if you look at let's say the uh, Turks uh, from Anatolia to the Armenian highlands, you have a fairly like if you took an average Turk, kind of a blind at random, right? You expect to see about 15 to 10 to 20% ancestry that is genuinely Central Asian. Now, you go to certain provinces in the deep west, southwest of Turkey in particular, you might have a higher percentage, sometimes close to 50% locally. But on average, it's 20. But the opposite happens when you go to the Armenian highlands. When you go to the Armenian highlands and you pick an average Turk, their percentage of Central Asian ancestry drops almost to zero, and they cluster very closely with Armenians and Kurds. So what you have in it's not the same story across the entire geography, but it's a similar story and a similar dynamic.
Yeah.
And it makes sense historically if you kind of follow the migration patterns of
Well,
Turkish states and stuff.
with that, and because I will now, because they will find us now, and there will be comments about who is and is not the real Turks for the rest of my life on this video.
Yeah, we're gonna be targeted. What's aren't they called
I'm
the white
used to that.
wolves or something?
Gray
Yeah.
wolves. Yeah.
They will find us because they always do when something like this happens.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts on
Yeah,
Armenia?
The gray wolves. If you love Turkey so much, why are you
Don't
going to
finish that
Ukraine to
sentence.
date the women there?
Don't finish that sentence. Stop whatever you do. Don't finish that sentence. Any last
Okay.
thoughts
It's
before we
funny.
sign off?
I guess with all these issues, I think uh, my main thought when discussing any of this is that the news is not enough to know what's going on. You have facts, but context matters, and um, in places like the Near East, but actually not only there, just anywhere in the world where humans are complex. We have complex societies, have complex histories, and boiling down things to headline level understanding is going to fail you exactly 100% of the time in understanding what's happening.
Yeah, I would have to agree very much so. That's why I don't run with things right when I get the news on them. I try to figure out what's happening first. So that's why we're always a week behind everyone. That's really it. Because I saw the Syria stuff. I'm like, uh-oh. I should probably try to get some clarity on this. Maybe we kind of did. And then I saw, rather the other Armenian Azerbaijan. I'm really losing it. I can't remember words tonight. I saw it yeah, it was a long day. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I saw that hopefully we'll get a little clarity going down the line. But yeah, I want to go ahead, Hatman. Any final thoughts you have?
I just agree with Tima. I mean, it's really it's almost impossible to to break down these events and conflicts into something that is understandable to your layman. It's just everything's very complex. Syria especially, but even the Azeri Armenian conflict is very complex. So yeah, it was a pleasure having you on. And,
thank you guys for inviting me back. It's great.
Yeah, and I hope we will in the future and under better circumstances. Like I hope that the worst case scenario doesn't come about. That cooler heads prevail, but it doesn't seem like that things are on the path towards that. So
yeah, history is the better guide than the hopes, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for coming on tonight too, Dima. I appreciate it immensely because uh, one of the things that I think we try our best to be both comprehensive but also understandable, and I appreciate you helping out with that.
Absolutely happy to be part of it. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, everyone else, I want to wish you all a very good night. Go ahead, take a walk, take your medicine, have fun, walk your pets. That's what I have to do now because he's about to jump on me. And have a good one.